he saw the slight limp when she walked past the nurse's station carrying fresh linens. He didn't see the 3-mile carry through mountain terrain that caused it. He didn't see the Special Forces commendation that named her guardian angel of the Hindu Kush. He didn't see the weight of 247 pounds of wounded operator balanced across her shoulders while rounds snapped through the alpine air above her head. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood at the central desk, his $4,200 Rolex catching the fluorescent glare, watching her move with the kind of quiet efficiency that made his jaw tighten. What he saw was a threat. What he didn't know would destroy him. Ashley Cooper moved through Seattle General in Denver with the precision of someone accustomed to being invisible. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead, casting harsh shadows across polished linoleum that smelled of industrial antiseptic mixed with stale coffee that had sat in the break room since 5 a.m. Her scrubs were crisp despite 12 hours on her feet, the fabric still carrying that hospital laundry detergent smell beneath the sharper notes of latex and disinfectant. She adjusted the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining during a quiet moment in the locker room, the only piece of her past she allowed herself to carry, and tucked it back against her ribs where it belonged. The patch was worn at the edges, the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines emblem nearly invisible, barely 3 inches from her heart. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody knew who she'd been. The ER at Seattle General operated with the controlled chaos of a Level 1 trauma center, the kind of place where the waiting room never emptied and the back room smelled like a mixture of fear and institutional desperation. Paramedics wheeled through the double doors on average every 4 minutes during the afternoon shift. Ashley had worked this hospital for 19 months, and in that time, she developed a reputation with the ambulance crews that had nothing to do with her credentials and everything to do with her judgment. They called her when they needed someone who wouldn't panic. They called her when they needed someone who understood that pain was data, that every vital sign told a story, that hesitation could cost lives. Room 307 was at the far end of the East Corridor, past the supply closet where the trauma shears hung in their designated spots and where the ventilator tubes were stored in color-coded sizes. Sergeant Jake Patterson lay in that room, recovering from a 14-day post-operative healing regimen following extensive skin graft surgery on his left shoulder. The grafted skin was pink and vulnerable, still in that fragile phase where infection was a constant threat. He'd been a weapons squad leader with 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, same unit that lived in the lining of her jacket, though he'd been stationed in the Helmand province while she'd been running a different kind of war 3 valleys over in the Hindu Kush. Patterson had visitors this afternoon, a friend from his civilian contracting company who'd driven down from Boulder, a man with a military bearing and eyes that tracked movement like a habit. They stood beside his bed, and Patterson was showing something that made them both lean in closer. The tattoo on Patterson's forearm read A. Cooper in clean, precise lettering, and Ashley saw him displaying it to his friend as she entered with the afternoon medication cart. She didn't pause. She didn't acknowledge the tattoo. She simply moved into the room with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every task, checking the foreport with steady hands and verifying the medication against his chart. The bentocaine cream needed reapplication. The antibiotic coverage was holding. She worked with the kind of mechanical precision that came from having done these things thousands of times before, in places where making a mistake meant someone's next breath would be their last. Patterson's friend was asking him about the story. She heard the question from across the room, the casual curiosity in his voice. "Where'd you get that tattoo? What's the story?" Ashley's hands didn't hesitate as she administered the afternoon pain medication, the push smooth and controlled, the needle withdrawn with the kind of practiced grace that came from having placed full lines in combat zones where the closest hospital was a 12-minute helicopter ride away. She could hear Patterson's voice rising slightly, excited to tell the story, and she adjusted the monitor without looking toward the bed. "Angel," Patterson said. "Guardian angel of the Hindu Kush. Saved my life in 2019. Carried me 3 miles through the mountains with rounds coming in from 3 directions. Didn't know her name for months. She never told us. Just appeared when we needed her and disappeared after. The kind of person you think is a dream until you wake up with scar tissue instead of bleeding out." Ashley moved to the next 4 site, checking the dressing, making a note in the chart. Her face remained impassive. Her hands remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Patterson continued, his voice carrying that reverent tone that soldiers used when they talked about people who'd saved their lives. His friend listened with the kind of attention that suggested he understood exactly what that story meant. Ashley finished her check, made her documentation, and was already halfway to the door when Patterson called out a standard thank you, the kind of thing patients said to all their nurses, generic and courteous and meaning nothing. "You're good, Coop," he said. Some patients had started using her last name when they saw it on the chart. None of them understood why it mattered. She nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and moved into the corridor. The heavy privacy door swung shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss. She didn't look back. She never looked back. The afternoon shift was entering its peak hour, and Seattle General's ER hummed with the kind of organized intensity that only came from people who understood their responsibilities. Ashley moved from room to room, her limp barely noticeable to the casual observer, just a slight favoring of the left leg, something that might have been from an old injury or poor sleep or the standing weight of a 12-hour shift. It was actually from the left side of her pelvis, where a round had caught her in the mountains and where the scar tissue pulled tight on certain movements. The physical therapist had cleared her for full duty 18 months ago. She'd gone back to work the day after the clearance came through. The paramedics recognized her when she appeared in the trauma bay. Their eyes tracked her the way they tracked the monitors and the crash cart and every other critical piece of equipment they needed to stay alive during the worst moments of their job. Marcus Ramirez, a driver for Denver Fire Department Ambulance 14, gave her a subtle nod as he transferred a patient with chest pain and a history of cardiac arrhythmias. He knew her. They all knew her. She knew what they needed before they asked. At the nurses' station, Dr. Marcus Mercer stood reviewing charts with the obsessive attention of someone who had built his entire career on the architecture of credentials. He'd graduated from Yale Medical School. He'd completed his emergency medicine residency at Johns Hopkins. He had 14 years of experience and a position as ER director that he'd secured through a combination of competence and, more importantly, through knowing people whose last names appeared on hospital buildings. He'd never carried anyone through the mountains. He'd never made field decisions under fire. He'd built his authority the way authority was supposed to be built, through the proper channels, the proper pedigree, the proper people who owed him favors and could help him climb. And then he watched Ashley Cooper walk past him with a confidence that had no diploma behind it. He noticed the way the paramedics deferred to her judgment. He noticed the way veteran patients requested her specifically for their medication rounds. He noticed the way other nurses paused in their work to listen to her when she offered suggestions about patient care. She wasn't the charge nurse. She wasn't in a position of authority. She was simply a registered nurse with no visible credentials displayed on the wall and no committee position and no faculty appointment to any medical school. Yet somehow, she commanded respect in a way that made his carefully constructed hierarchy feel fragile. Dr. Mercer had worked for 19 months to establish his dominance in this ER. He'd made sure everyone understood the chain of command. He'd subtly corrected junior doctors who overstepped. He'd established protocols that required his approval for certain decisions. He'd cultivated relationships with the hospital administration so that his direction on unit matters carried weight. And none of that seemed to matter when Ashley Cooper was in the room, because people simply followed her lead as if she'd been giving orders her entire career. He watched her now as she checked a junior nurse's technique on a peripheral full line. The junior nurse, Michael Chen, first week on the unit, had the catheter angle slightly wrong, not steep enough to thread smoothly. Ashley stood beside him, her voice so quiet he couldn't hear the words from across the room, but he watched Michael's face shift from uncertainty to understanding. She wasn't critical. She wasn't correcting him like he was failing. She was simply showing him a better way, and he watched 3 other nurses pause their work to observe the demonstration. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. His hand clenched around the pen he'd been holding. She had no authority to be conducting informal training. She had no title that gave her the right to supervise other medical staff. She was overstepping scope of practice with every quiet suggestion, with every gentle correction, with every moment that made other people look to her instead of looking to him for direction. He made a mental note. The pattern had been forming for weeks, but now it crystallized into something actionable. Nobody in this ER was going to look past his credentials. Nobody was going to choose quiet competence over the hierarchy he'd established. Ashley Cooper might move through these halls like she belonged there, might command respect she hadn't earned, might make other people want to follow her lead. But that was going to change. The Ramirez family crowded around bed 12 as Dr. Mercer reviewed their father's chart, his Rolex catching the sterile light of Seattle General's ICU wing. The elderly man lay still beneath white sheets, his oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath, while his daughter clutched his hand and his two sons stood rigid in the corner, the kind of rigid that comes from understanding the difference between recovery and goodbye. Ashley moved forward with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that presence without noise carried more weight than volume. She'd been watching the potassium levels for 18 hours, tracking the slow climb that shouldn't have been climbing, not with a patient whose kidneys had stopped filtering anything meaningful 6 days ago. "Doctor, the potassium dosage," she said, her voice level as a surgical blade. "That's 40 milliequivalents for a patient with renal insufficiency." The labs show. Mercer's smile arrived before his words did, the kind of smile that announced he'd already decided how this conversation would end. "Nurse Cooper," he said, closing the chart with deliberate slowness. "I attended Johns Hopkins. Where did you train again?" The family watched the exchange like spectators at a tennis match, their anxiety multiplying with each second of silence. Ashley's hands remained steady at her sides, the faintest tension appearing along her jawline, visible only to someone trained to read the micro-expressions that betrayed what composure tried to hide. "Seattle Community College, Doctor." "Exactly," he said, making the notation himself with a pen that probably cost more than her shift's entire wage. He didn't increase the potassium. He didn't adjust anything. He simply made his decision visible and moved on, leaving her standing beside the bed like a piece of furniture that had briefly attempted speech. 2 hours later, when the shift change had just begun and the patient bays were crowded with the hand-off ritual of nursing, incoming staff clustered around beds, asking questions, taking notes, establishing the continental map of who was stable and who was eroding, Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the carefully managed chaos like an air raid siren in a library. "Nurse Cooper." A word. The medication cart where she stood dispensing evening antibiotics seemed to freeze the moment she heard it. Not a request. A command delivered to an audience, calculated for maximum echo through the patient bay, timed to catch not just staff but 3 families waiting in chairs, their eyes lifting like prey sensing movement. She set down the syringe with controlled precision and walked toward him, knowing what was coming because she could read the architecture of humiliation the way other people read room temperature. He unfolded a written reprimand like he was unveiling evidence at a trial, holding it so the assembled staff could see his authority taking physical form on paper. His voice climbed slightly with each sentence, performing for the crowd now, no longer just speaking to her but to everyone within a 30-foot radius. Overstepping scope of practice. Undermining physician authority. Contradicting orders in front of patients. Effective immediately, written warning number 1. The words hung in the air like smoke from a muzzle flash. Around them, the paramedics suddenly developed intense interest in their clipboards. The 2 nurses prepping bed 14 found urgent reasons to turn their backs. One of the visiting families rose and walked toward the bathroom, unable to watch. Ashley stood motionless while he read, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond his left shoulder, the kind of 1,000-yard stare that had become familiar to anyone who'd ever spent time in combat. Her knuckles, the ones gripping the medication cart, whitened almost imperceptibly, the tiny rebellion of bone against skin the only physical evidence that anything beneath her scrubs was processing what was happening. When he finished, she nodded once. A single downward movement of her head. No apology. No explanation. No defense. She turned and walked back to the medication cart with the same measured pace she'd approached him with, and resumed the work of keeping people alive while the man who'd just humiliated her stood watching to see if she would flinch. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next, the systematic unraveling that started the following morning. The break room exodus began on Wednesday. Ashley pushed through the door at 6:02 a.m., early enough to eat breakfast before the first rounds, her lunch bag in one hand and her coffee in the other. The room had 4 nurses inside, 2 at the corner table reviewing a protocol, one reading her phone in the vinyl chair by the window, another filling a water bottle at the sink. They'd been talking. She could taste the evidence of it in the sudden weight of silence when she appeared. One of the junior nurses glanced at the others with the kind of micro-expression that was actually a conversation, a full negotiation conducted in the raised arch of an eyebrow. "Oh," the one by the sink said, voice bright with artificial urgency. "I just remembered I need to check on 214. His dressing needs changing." She was out the door in 12 seconds, her water bottle abandoned on the counter. The one reading her phone stood with slightly more care. "Sorry, I have to finish charting before the 7 a.m. briefing." "Gone." The 2 at the protocol table exchanged a glance, and the one on the right said, "Actually, we should probably review this on the unit. Mercer's going to ask questions." They gathered their papers with the choreography of people who had practiced this exit before, who had refined it through repetition. Within 90 seconds, Ashley sat alone at a table meant for 12, mechanically eating a bowl of oatmeal with mechanical precision, staring at the laminate surface of the table as if it contained information vital to human survival. This continued through Thursday and Friday. The break room became a place of strategic escape whenever her shadow crossed the threshold. Conversations died mid-sentence. People suddenly remembered urgent tasks. The message was transmitted silently but with absolute clarity. Proximity to Ashley Cooper was contagion. Whatever Mercer had marked her with, whatever his judgment had declared about her fitness, had begun to move like an infection through the social structure of the unit. By Wednesday afternoon, Mercer had begun the second phase, the public naming. During rounds, when Ashley was standing beside a patient's bed with the medication administration record in her hands, he would say it loud enough for the surrounding patients to hear, loud enough for the new residents to process and file away. "Let's see what our clipboard warrior thinks about evidence-based medicine today." The newer staff members laughed, nervous, uncertain laughter, the sound of people testing the limits of what they could get away with. The older nurses looked at the floor. Sergeant Patterson, recovering in room 307 from his skin graft, said nothing. He just watched from his bed with the kind of stillness that suggested he was cataloguing details, the way her hands didn't shake, the way her voice didn't change, the way she continued delivering his evening medications with the same precision she always had while clipboard warrior echoed in the hallway behind her. On Friday morning, before the 6 a.m. shift began, a new red-inked notice appeared on the unit board where everyone doing shift change had to look, a physical manifestation of judgment displayed like it was breaking news. Final warning, N. Cooper for repeated violations of chain of command. The signature was dated the previous afternoon, backdated to give it the weight of an official decision made in private and now merely being announced. Ashley read it while standing completely still in front of the board, her eyes moving across the words with a kind of methodical precision that suggested she was memorizing coordinates, building a map of territory. Her chest expanded once with a breath that came from deeper than surface lungs. She turned and walked to the supply closet, the one at the end of the hallway that most staff used only for storing extra tubing and bandages. She was inside for 30 seconds. Exactly. The fluorescent light hummed overhead like a wasp trapped in amber. Her eyes closed. Her breathing changed, the military-trained transition from civilian pattern respiration to the controlled diaphragmatic technique that kept cortisol from spiking, heart rate from climbing, the physical chaos of rage from showing in her pupils or pulse. 30 seconds of nothing but the sound of her own exhale, steady as a metronome, steady as someone who had learned the hard way that showing pain was a tactical disadvantage. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her scrubs, and walked back to patient care. In room 307, Sergeant Patterson was sitting up in his hospital bed when a group of visiting veterans arrived, 3 men in leather jackets bearing the insignia of a motorcycle club for retired military, men whose forearms were mapped with the geography of their own survival. Patterson's shoulder had begun the long process of healing, the skin graft taking hold, the tissue knitting back together in the strange mathematics of trauma recovery. He was explaining something to them, his voice animated in a way it rarely was with the medical staff, and he pulled up his sleeve to reveal the tattoo that covered his inner forearm, A. Cooper, in bold black letters, the kind of tattoo that spoke of gratitude carved into flesh. This here, he was telling them, lifting his arm to the light so the letters caught and held it. This is the call sign of the woman who pulled me out of the Hindu Kush when I had 40 caliber rounds coming in from 3 directions. Angel 6, we called her. Best field medic I've ever seen, and I've served with the best. He turned as Ashley entered with his evening medications, the 4 lines she needed to flush before the night shift took over. The room full of veterans fell silent, all of them looking at her, waiting for something, recognition, acknowledgement, some sign that this was the woman they'd been hearing about. Ashley set the supplies on the bedside table with practiced efficiency. She didn't look at Sergeant Patterson. She didn't acknowledge the recognition that hung in the air like smoke. She simply did the work in front of her, flushing the line, documenting the action, moving with the professional silence of someone who had learned that attention was dangerous, that being seen was the beginning of all problems. Sergeant Patterson watched her hands move, watched the steady concentration in her face, watched her walk back out of the room, and then he looked at his brothers in leather and said quietly, "That's her. That's the angel." The cafeteria lunch rush peaked at 12:33 p.m. on a Tuesday, 11 days after the written warning. The cafeteria lunch rush peaked at 12:06 p.m. on a Tuesday, 11 days after the written warning. Ashley stood in the serving line with a plastic tray, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned long ago that invisibility required consistency. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in a sickly institutional white. Around her, doctors and nurses and administrative staff formed the organized chaos of a hospital feeding itself, conversations overlapping, trays clattering, the hiss of steam from the warming tables creating a low percussion beneath the noise. She was reaching for a cup of coffee when the sound came. Not a crack. Not a warning. A groan, deep and metallic, followed by the shriek of steel separating from steel. The entire west section of the ceiling came down. 1 second there was ordinary hospital noise. The next, there was chaos wrapped in dust and the sound of 1,000 things breaking at once. Ashley turned. Everyone turned. The collapse had happened 40 feet away, a section of acoustic tile and steel beam that had simply decided to stop holding itself up. Dust rolled through the cafeteria like smoke. People screamed. Someone dropped a tray. The acrid smell of pulverized drywall filled the air instantly. And pinned beneath the largest beam, his upper body crushed against a lunch table, was Dr. Mercer. Ashley moved before her mind caught up with the decision. Not toward the panic. Toward the beam. Toward the man whose face was already starting to change color, whose breathing, when she could see it, had become labored and shallow. The beam had him at the sternum, a weight that would crush a normal man and was already crushing him. "Get me help," someone shouted. "Call 911. Someone get a doctor." Ashley dropped to her knees beside Mercer, her hands already moving with the muscle memory of 17 years and 100 moments worse than this. The beam pressed down with maybe 800 pounds of force. His face was pale. His breathing was coming in short, panic bursts. His right lung had collapsed, she could hear it in the sound, the quality of air movement, the way his body was working twice as hard to move half as much oxygen. Tension pneumothorax. The air pocket between his lung and chest wall pressing everything sideways, suffocating him from inside out. She didn't wait for help. She didn't wait for permission. She moved to the medication station 40 feet away. The cafeteria had a crash cart, mandatory in any space where 300 people gathered, and retrieved a 14-gauge angiocath needle. 14-gauge. Large bore. Perfect for emergency decompression. Her hands were steady. They always were. When she returned, Dr. Mercer's eyes were starting to roll. Consciousness flickering like a light with a bad connection. Around them, the cafeteria had transformed into a scene of controlled emergency. 2 paramedics were already there, kneeling beside the beam. A nurse from surgery was calling out vitals. But they were frozen in the moment of assessment, the moment of deciding what to do about 800 pounds of steel. Ashley didn't freeze. She positioned herself at Mercer's chest wall, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Standard landmark. The place where a collapsed lung could be reached with a needle and steady hands. She'd done this before. Not in a cafeteria. In the dark. In a convoy under sniper fire outside Kandahar, her hands moving with the same precision as now while blood pooled beneath a sergeant named Patterson and his breathing came in desperate gasps. The needle went in. The hiss came instantly, that specific sound of pressurized air escaping through a small opening, the sound of a life being saved by physics and anatomy and someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The color began returning to Mercer's face almost immediately. His breathing deepened. The panic in his eyes started to fade as his lungs could finally expand, as oxygen began moving again through passages that had been slowly suffocating. One of the paramedics stared at her. "Did you just?" "Tension pneumo," Ashley said quietly. Stating the obvious. Stating the save. He needed to breathe. Mercer's eyes focused. Found hers. And in that moment, suspended in the dust and chaos and the aftermath of something catastrophic, recognition bloomed across his face. Not confusion. Not gratitude. Recognition. He knew who she was. Or he was beginning to know. This was no ordinary nurse. This was someone whose hands moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, someone who'd just performed an emergency procedure without hesitation or doubt or consultation. Someone who shouldn't have known how to do that. Someone who definitely wasn't supposed to. The paramedics took over then. The fire department arrived. The beam was being rigged with hydraulic cutters. Mercer was loaded onto a stretcher, his eyes never leaving Ashley's as she stepped back, her gloved hand still holding the angiocath needle that had just saved his life. She disposed of the needle in a sharps container and walked back to her locker. By the next morning, the hospital had transformed the narrative. The local news ran a story about the heroic cafeteria collapse and the paramedics who'd freed Dr. Mercer from the beam. No mention of the nurse. No mention of the needle decompression. Just the paramedics and the rescue equipment and the doctor who'd narrowly escaped death. Ashley was standing at her locker at 6:16 a.m. when security supervisor Raines handed her an envelope. His face was apologetic. His voice was soft. "You're being called to a disciplinary hearing at 2 p.m. She opened the envelope. Disciplinary hearing. Patient Safety Review Panel. Effective immediately, report to Conference Room B in the HR suite. The hearing room was small. Windowless. The kind of space designed to feel smaller the more you sat in it. Dr. Mercer was there, his arm immobilized in a sling, his face dark with bruising that made him look like a man who'd lost a fight with something much larger than himself. He looked up when she entered. His expression was complicated. Gratitude and something else. Something like resentment that she'd had to be the one to save him. Patricia Walsh, the HR director, sat at the head of the table. Across from her, representing the hospital's legal interests, was a woman Ashley didn't recognize. And on the disciplinary panel, the decision-making panel, was Charge Nurse Simmons. The same Simmons who'd been skimming pharmaceutical supplies for 2 months. The same Simmons who was the centerpiece of the surveillance operation Ashley had been running. Dr. Mercer slid a document across the table. It was thick. 20 pages at least. Emergency complaint, he said, his voice measured and almost regretful. Practicing medicine without a license. I'm grateful she saved my life. Truly grateful. But we cannot allow nursing staff to perform invasive procedures regardless of outcome. Patient safety demands we maintain clear scope of practice boundaries. Walsh opened the file. Security camera footage stills. Clear images of Ashley performing the needle decompression. Witness statements from 3 cafeteria staff members. A detailed analysis of hospital protocols violated, each one numbered and cited. Specific statutes. Specific language from the hospital's scope of practice policy. It was competent. It was thorough. It was the work of a man who understood institutional power and how to weaponize it. Ashley sat with her hands folded in her lap, expressionless. She could argue. She could explain the emergency conditions. She could cite the principle of necessity, the legal doctrine that permitted emergency procedures outside normal scope when life was in immediate danger. She could win this hearing. But winning required explaining why she'd been running surveillance on Simmons. Why she'd spent 2 months documenting pharmaceutical diversion. Why she was really at Seattle General. Why the federal government had sanctioned her placement. Winning meant blowing a 2-month operation. Blowing the investigation. Blowing the chance to dismantle a drug diversion ring that had already resulted in 2 patients receiving contaminated medications. She made her choice in the silence. Immediate termination for patient safety concerns, Walsh read from a prepared letter. Effective today. Ashley nodded once. Security walked her to her locker. Stood by while she packed. The chipped mug reading World's Okayest Nurse, Marcus had given it to her when he was 10 years old, before he knew what his mother really was. A half-dead succulent she'd never remembered to water, somehow still clinging to life in its plastic pot. A photo from Kandahar, 2019. Her Special Forces unit grinning in desert tan. Sergeant Patterson. Specialist Chen. Captain Rodriguez. She hadn't heard from Rodriguez in 4 years. Chen had been killed in 2021. Patterson was the one with her tattoo on his forearm. The only one left. She signed the exit paperwork without reading it. Her signature was the same as always, controlled, professional, complete. She didn't rush. She didn't tremble. She didn't give Simmons or Mercer or anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. The rain started as she walked to the bus stop on Colfax Avenue. Not gentle rain. Real rain. The kind that soaked through jackets and made the world smell like wet concrete and disappointment. Ashley stood with her cardboard box balanced on her hip, watching buses pass. Number 12. Number 6. Number 18. Each one carrying people with somewhere to be, somewhere they mattered, somewhere they weren't standing in the rain at 3:45 p.m. having just lost everything that mattered to the operation. Her phone was silent. No texts from Marcus. No calls from her handler explaining what came next. Nothing but the sound of rain hammering the sidewalk and the distant wail of traffic on Colfax and the simple fact that she was standing in Denver getting soaked, unemployed, and no closer to dismantling a drug ring than she'd been 12 weeks ago. That's when her phone rang. The HR letter arrived at 2:16 p.m. on a Tuesday, printed on official hospital letterhead and sealed in a manila envelope that felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Immediate termination for patient safety. The words blurred together as Ashley sat at her kitchen table, the envelope unopened for exactly 7 minutes before she finally broke the seal. Her hands didn't shake. Never had. Not in the mountains, not under fire, not while holding a bleeding man's intestines together with gauze and willpower. She wouldn't start now. But reading those words, seeing her career dismantled in 18 paragraphs of HR boilerplate, Ashley understood what had really happened. Dr. Mercer had filed his complaint at 6:03 a.m., before she'd even clocked out. By noon, the hospital's legal team had rubber-stamped it. By 2:19 p.m., Captain Ashley Cooper was a civilian again, at least officially. The real problem wasn't the letter. The real problem was that fighting it would require her to explain exactly why a staff nurse with no medical degree had performed an emergency surgical decompression. It would require testimony. It would require statements. And every single word of that testimony would shatter the 2-month surveillance operation she'd been running from inside the medication dispensary, watching charge nurse Simmons divert $847,000 in controlled pharmaceuticals through a distribution network tied to a cartel supervisor operating out of a warehouse in Commerce City. The Pentagon had sanctioned this. Task Force 121 had embedded her here specifically because she could move through a hospital like a shadow, because she knew how to watch, how to document, how to build a case that would stick. 2 months of work. 7 weeks of compressed intelligence gathering. And one cafeteria ceiling had ended it all. She closed her eyes. The investigation was over. The Pentagon would have to find another way in, another angle, another operative who could slip past the system's defenses. Ashley had failed. Not at saving Dr. Mercer's life, that part had worked perfectly. Textbook needle decompression, O2 climbing back to safe levels, the man breathing again. She'd failed at the actual mission. The one nobody at Seattle General knew existed. Rain hammered the kitchen window as she sat motionless, still wearing the damp scrubs from that morning's shift. 41 hours ago, she'd been a nurse. 39 hours ago, she'd been fired. 38 hours ago, she'd stood at a bus stop on Colfax Avenue in weather that felt like the sky was weeping alongside her, holding a cardboard box that contained her entire life outside the uniform. A chipped mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse." A half-dead succulent she'd been meaning to water since February. And a photo of her team in Kandahar from March 2019, 5 faces arranged on a rooftop at sunset, everyone's arm around someone's shoulder, everyone smiling like they didn't know 3 of those faces would exist only in memory by September. Patterson. Holder. Chen. Gone. The photo was 7 years old and simultaneously the newest one she carried. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted her from the spiral. Not a gentle close, a violent yank and slam, the kind that meant anger or panic or both. Then the front door burst open without a knock, and her 16-year-old son Marcus stood dripping wet in the entryway, his high school letterman jacket clinging to his shoulders, his face flushed the particular shade of red that meant he'd driven too fast and thought about nothing but the destination. In his arms, pressed against his chest like he was carrying something that might break, was her shadow box. The frame that held the medals. The frame that had been locked in her bedroom closet behind 3 sweaters, behind a wall of normalcy, behind everything she'd built to stay invisible. Ashley rose slowly. Marcus. Don't. They need to see these, Mom. His voice cracked on the word Mom, 15 years old and 8 years old simultaneously, the voice of a boy who'd just realized his mother wasn't who he thought. You can't just let him win. He doesn't get to fire you and just. Marcus. No. He was backing toward the door already, still clutching the shadow box like it was a life raft. This is wrong. It's not fair. He has no idea who you are. Don't go to the hospital. Flat. Command voice. The one she saved for critical situations. Give me the box. We'll figure this out. But he was already in motion, already opening his car door, already disappearing into the rain-soaked evening with her entire hidden history pressed against his letterman jacket. Ashley reached the porch just in time to see his taillights bleeding red through the downpour, heading west, heading toward Seattle General, heading toward the exact disaster she'd been trying to prevent. She closed her eyes. Her son had just driven straight into a minefield while carrying live ordnance, and she couldn't stop him. All those years of training, all those operations in hostile territory, and the one place she was powerless was right here, in her own kitchen, watching her cover dissolve into rain. By 4:17 p.m., Marcus was standing in the center of Seattle General's emergency department during the afternoon shift change, and the room had the particular density that comes from 24 staff members frozen mid-motion, mid-conversation, mid-breath. The shadow box hung open in his shaking hands. The medals caught the fluorescent lighting like small pieces of lightning. A visiting patient, a retired Marine in a wheelchair waiting for discharge, had already wheeled forward. The man's hands, Ashley would later learn, had held enough weapons and enough weight to know what a real medal looked like. He lifted the Purple Heart with the reverence of someone who understood exactly what kind of fire it took to earn it. Captain Ashley Cooper, the Marine read aloud, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent treatment area. United States Army Special Forces. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush Mountains, Afghanistan, March 2019. The words hung there like physical objects, dense and impossible to ignore. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway at that exact moment. His mouth opened to demand that security remove the teenager, to restore order, to reassert the hierarchy that kept him at the top of the pyramid. But the words died in his throat as a two-star general, Major General Robert Keane, visiting his nephew in room for 12 with a gunshot wound from a failed robbery attempt, stepped forward in dress uniform and rendered a salute that came from somewhere deeper than protocol. His fist struck his chest. His arm extended to the medals. His face remained perfectly composed. "Someone tell me," the general said quietly, "what this young man means by fired." The room didn't just go silent. The room forgot how to breathe. In room 307, where a certain Special Forces sergeant with a fresh skin graft was reviewing his discharge paperwork, the sound of his own name being read aloud at high volume brought everything into focus. He wheeled himself to the doorway, his eyes landing on the shadow box, the medals, the teenage boy in the Letterman jacket. "Hey, Cooper!" His voice carried the weight of 7 years and 3 continents and a debt that could never be repaid. "That's, where is she? The nurse who's been taking care of me, where's Captain, where is she?" The room erupted like someone had thrown a match into gasoline. The room erupted like someone had thrown a match into gasoline. Sergeant Patterson's voice cracked with recognition, with gratitude, with the weight of 3 miles through enemy fire compressed into 4 words. Nurses stopped mid-stride. The cardiac monitor's steady beep seemed suddenly loud. Everyone turned toward the ER entrance, waiting for her, not understanding yet that the woman they were looking for had already been standing here all along, invisible in scrubs, saving lives without anyone asking her name. 2 miles away, Marcus Cooper sat in his bedroom staring at the shadow box his mother kept on the highest shelf of her closet, behind winter clothes and sealed boxes of memories she never opened. The Purple Heart. The Bronze Star. 2 silver stars. A medal he didn't recognize with oak leaf clusters. His hands shook as he lifted the glass frame. Not from fear. From rage. His mom stood at a bus stop in the rain because she'd saved someone's life and gotten fired for it. His mom, who'd carried a bleeding soldier 3 miles through mountains while people shot at her. His mom, who was standing in their kitchen right now pretending everything was fine, pretending it didn't matter that some administrator with a smirk and a degree from an Ivy League school had destroyed her career with a pen. The shadow box weighed nothing. The medals inside represented everything. Marcus grabbed his car keys and walked past his mother without a word. The drive to Seattle General took 11 minutes. He ran 3 red lights. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The afternoon shift change meant the ER would be crowded, nurses rotating out, residents arriving, the chaos of transition. He parked in the visitor zone and walked through the sliding doors with the open shadow box held against his chest like evidence. The ER bay was exactly as crowded as he'd hoped. 20 staff members visible. A retiring nurse being introduced. 3 new residents in their white coats looking terrified and important. Marcus walked straight toward the center of the room where Sergeant Patterson was sitting up in a hospital bed, and he held up the shadow box so everyone could see. A retired Marine stood up without being asked. His name was David Holloway, 73 years old, with a chest full of his own medals that he'd removed from his dress uniform before coming to visit his nephew. His hands were steady as he reached for the Purple Heart. His voice was the sound of someone who'd given orders across 3 decades. Captain Ashley Cooper. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Under sustained enemy fire, Captain Cooper provided tactical medical intervention and extracted a critically wounded soldier from an active combat zone, traveling 3.2 miles under fire conditions, demonstrating exceptional courage and medical expertise in direct support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Award authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He paused. Read it again, because the room had gone absolutely silent. That's her. That's the woman who's been taking care of us. Dr. Robert Mercer appeared in the ER doorway at that exact moment, his mouth already opening to demand security remove the teenager, already composing the words about hospital policy and unauthorized personnel, and he froze. His eyes moved from the medals to Marcus to the retired Marine and then to the back of the ER where a 2-star general, Major General Patricia Hayes, who'd arrived 2 hours ago to visit his wounded nephew, stood up from a plastic chair and stepped forward with the movement of someone who'd spent 40 years commanding respect without asking for it. A hand came up to her forehead in a salute so crisp it sounded like a gunshot. The medal, the Navy Cross, the one reserved for extraordinary heroism in combat, caught the fluorescent lights and threw them back at Mercer like an accusation. Mercer's face went pale. Not angry. Not defiant. Pale. He turned and walked back down the hallway toward his office, and nobody followed him because they didn't need to. The story was already being told by the medals themselves. By evening, a Pentagon liaison named Colonel James Brennan had arrived at the hospital administrator's office with a classified briefing document and a statement. Captain Ashley Cooper's nursing position at Seattle General had been a sanctioned federal cover operation. The pharmaceutical diversion investigation she'd been conducting, on her own time, using documentation that only she had access to, had been approved at the Department of Defense level. Her termination had constituted interference with a federal investigation and breach of operational security protocols. The hospital could expect a formal review. The phone footage was already spreading. Someone had recorded Dr. Mercer's face during Ashley's termination hearing, that smirk, that theatrical sigh when she refused to defend herself, the way he'd leaned back in his chair like he'd won something. The video was forwarded to his medical school mentor, Dr. Patricia Chen, who served as Surgeon General of the United States. By 10 p.m., Chen had released a statement from Washington, D.C. "I am appalled and ashamed to learn that Dr. Robert Mercer, whom I once mentored, engaged in systematic harassment and wrongful termination of a decorated military officer. The footage demonstrates a pattern of deliberate cruelty and professional misconduct. Effective immediately, I am severing all professional association and have requested the Colorado State Medical Board conduct an urgent ethics review." The hospital's legal team appeared at Mercer's office at 9 a.m. the next morning. Paid suspension pending investigation. His hospital ID badge was confiscated. His access codes deactivated. Security escorted him out of the building at 9:22 a.m., and in the parking lot, Sergeant Patterson, now mobile enough to leave his bed, stood waiting. He didn't say anything. He just stared at Mercer with the look of someone who'd watched this man file complaints against the woman who'd saved his life. "She carried me 3 miles, Patterson said quietly. "You couldn't carry her toolbox." The Colorado State Medical Board hearing lasted for weeks. 17 staff members testified. Documentation of written warnings. Records of humiliation campaigns. Testimony from nurses about the break room comments, the deliberate social isolation, the way Mercer had worked to undermine her credibility. The cafeteria footage showing Ashley's competent needle decompression while Mercer remained unconscious. The complaint filed less than 18 hours after she'd saved his life. The board found egregious violations, abuse of authority, retaliation, creation of a hostile work environment, breach of professional ethics. His license was suspended for 18 months. Mandatory ethics training. 200 hours of community service. The service assignment came through on a Tuesday, teaching CPR to teenagers at Denver Community College, starting immediately, for minimum wage, $16.50 per hour. 6 months later, Marcus sat in his AP government class when his phone buzzed. A text message from his mom with a single photo attached. Dr. Mercer standing in front of a CPR dummy, teenagers slumped in chairs around him paying absolutely no attention, a supervisor with a clipboard watching from the side of the room. The caption read, $16.50 per hour. Week 24 of community service. Marcus smiled and took a photo of his own from the live stream on his laptop. His mom standing at a Senate subcommittee hearing podium in her dress uniform, the faded Special Forces unit patch now visible on her shoulder where it belonged, no longer hidden inside her jacket lining. The pharmaceutical diversion ring she'd documented during those 2 months undercover, 14 arrests, including the charge nurse who'd been stealing oxycodone and the surgical supply distributor who'd been moving it, had been dismantled entirely because of her work. The senators thanked her publicly for her service, both in uniform and undercover. Ashley returned to Seattle General one final time, not as an employee but as a guest speaker for the new veteran hiring initiative. The ER staff gave her a standing ovation. Sergeant Patterson, now cleared for active duty, presented her with a squadron coin. "I've been trying to figure out how to thank you," he said quietly. "I've known it was you for months, and I still can't find the words." "You already did," Ashley said, and touched the tattoo on his forearm, the initials AC that he'd carried with him for 7 years. "You carried me home when I needed it most." The hospital had installed a plaque on their memorial wall in honor of Captain Ashley Cooper, who reminded us that true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Ashley stood before it with Marcus, his arm around her shoulders. The afternoon sun broke through Denver's clouds and illuminated the letters like a benediction. "You think he ever figured it out?" Marcus asked. "Figured what out?" "That you weren't just good at nursing. That you were exactly where you needed to be." Ashley touched the plaque, remembering the rain at the bus stop, the cardboard box with her chipped mug, the moment she'd thought she'd failed. Her limp was still visible as she walked, a reminder of the Hindu Kush, of 7 years of silence, of standing motionless while someone tried to break her in public. "I think he figured out what matters," she said quietly. "Competence without ego. Service without recognition." They walked out of Seattle General together into the Denver afternoon. Somewhere across town, in a community college classroom that smelled like plastic and desperation, Dr. Mercer corrected a teenager's hand placement on a CPR dummy for the 87th time that week, his medical school diploma gathering dust in a box at home, his name no longer mentioned in the same breath as medicine or honor or anything except the mistake he'd made when he decided to destroy someone who was already saving the world. Subscribe for more stories of heroes standing quietly in plain sight. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value.